Hello everybody that's coming in. Hello, welcome to this evening's GAIN session. It's great of you to join us. My name's Becky and I work at GAIN, and I just wanted to flag at the top of the hour before we get into tonight's discussion with our brilliant panelists that the GAIN Empower Investment Internship for 2023 is open now for applications. So if you haven't already applied, time is ticking on. It closes on October the 23rd, so we've got a few weeks for you to get your application in if you are looking for an internship next year. So you can find all the details at gainuk.org. And if you're heading to our website, I'd really encourage you to sign up to our fortnightly newsletter, which details all the events like this, our internship program, our insight program, and loads of other good stuff as well. But for now, I will hand you over to Tilly Franklin, who is moderating this evening's session, and she can kick off.
Great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people joining this evening. I think people are continuing to join, but we'll just get started. My name is Tilly Franklin. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at the University of Cambridge Endowment Fund, and also one of the founders of GAIN. And I'm really excited this evening to be joined by this marvelous group of panelists who are going to help us think about interview questions to be prepared for in search for a role in investment management. So rather than me trying to do justice to it, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their role, and then we'll kick straight off with some questions. So maybe I can ask Rachel first to introduce herself.
Thanks, Tilly, and thanks for joining, everyone. So I'm Rachel Allen. I'm the head of talent for Ruffer, which is an asset management and wealth management company. So my role is I head up early careers and early careers recruitment and development. So graduates, interns, trainees, apprentices, the whole gamut. I also run Ruffer's learning and development and all of our diversity and inclusion activities.
Great, thanks. Perry?
Hi everyone, my name's Perry Beard and I'm an associate at Alliance Bernstein. I have just recently joined from Janice Henderson and I work in client relations, so basically sales, selling funds to wealth managers, financial advisors, and anything client related. I'm really excited to be here and hopefully I can give you some useful insight on the application process, as I only went through it last year when I finished university.
Great, thanks so much. And finally, last but not least, Stan.
Thanks, Tilly. So my name's Stan. I currently work as an investment analyst for Man Group. I've been a part of their graduate scheme, which I've rotated through RI, or ESG, it's more commonly known, and within sales and marketing as well. So I've seen a few different roles in my relatively short career so far. And similar to Perry, I've been through the interview process relatively recently, so hopefully I can offer an insight or two.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're really fortunate this evening to have panelists who kind of come at this from both sides, in terms of Rachel actually being on the recruitment side of the industry, among many other things, and understanding what employers are looking for, and then to panelists who relatively recently been through the graduate recruitment process themselves. So maybe just to set the scene, it would be great to hear from Rachel a bit about, what are some of the general things that employers are looking for in the investment industry, and kind of what kind of topics should our attendees be thinking about at a high level?
Yeah, thanks, Tilly. So I think that there's a few things to sort of bear in mind. You probably will face the dreaded question of, so just tell me a bit about yourself, or talk me through your CV at some point during the interview process. So I think, have your story prepared for that. And then I was thinking about, what are the skills that employers are really, really looking for? And I think that one of the principles that I start from is about potential. So, we know that you have been in education for a long time and you might not have had the opportunity to experience all the things that someone my age has in terms of different roles, different skills and knowledge. So I'm really focused on potential. And then I thought, okay, what are the questions that we ask? So I've been back through multiple years of what questions have we asked our early careers recruits over the years. And I've sort of put them into a few categories, if you like. So I'm just going to try and run through those. I will try not to talk for too long. But I kind of came up with sort of half a dozen distinct categories. So I think curiosity, I think that's really important. People who take an interest in the world around them, people who want to grow and develop themselves and want to build their skills and knowledge. So I think absolutely curiosity, you know, what are you passionate about outside of the subject that you're studying at university? What do you care about? So I think curiosity is really important. And then I think problem solving is also really up there. And I think, you know, you may well encounter the sort of classic question of what challenges you've encountered and most importantly, how you've worked to overcome those. So, you know, what problems have you encountered at university, in a part-time job, in a team project that you've worked on, and how have you worked through that? I think self-awareness is important. So, you know, what have you learned about yourself? What are your strengths? What are your potential areas for development? And I know there's pitfalls with those questions. You know, I do hear the classic, well, I'm such a perfectionist and it's, you know, difficult to get everything done because I want to do everything perfectly. So I think just be true to yourself and think about what real examples you have. You know, as an employer, we do know that you are real people and, you know, we don't expect you to be perfect at everything. So just sort of give us a true flavor of yourself. I think resilience, that has really sort of hit home, especially through the pandemic. That is a sort of word that we're focusing on more and more. How are you dealing with challenges? What happens when you fail at something? And how do you kind of pick yourself back up again? So I think those kind of questions are important to reflect on. Working with people, you know, this is a people-based industry. So how do you go about building relationships with your colleagues, with clients, with other external stakeholders? And, you know, what happens when people are a bit resistant, or you have a really challenging stakeholder that you have to build a relationship with? How do you demonstrate tenacity in kind of working to make sure that is a fluid relationship? And then I think the last one, sort of bundled in together, I've sort of just got something about being helpful, honest, demonstrating integrity. So, you know, investment is a complex industry. We know that. We know that mistakes can be made. We know that, you know, it can be, there's lots of judgment calls. So how do you go about making those decisions with honesty, integrity, and being sort of positive and helpful towards your clients and colleagues? So I realise that's a lot of information in a short period of time. Really happy to be to take questions on any of that, and, you know, hear from Perry and Stan as to whether some of those things were questions that you encountered, and anything sort of additional.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. That's really, really helpful. And I can certainly say, as somebody who's regularly involved in graduate recruitment, that we also look for all of those things, and I think they're all really foundational aspects of what employers are looking for in investment management, but very likely also in almost all kind of professional spheres, certainly some of those fundamental skills around problem solving, self-awareness, relationship skills, and so on. But I think it would be great to come on to hear from Perry and Stan a bit more specifically about how they actually dealt with demonstrating some of these things. But before that, one of the things that we were talking about when we were getting to know each other before this is the importance of research. When you're going for a new role, how important it is to be prepared. And Perry had specifically brought that up. So before we just jump into unpacking some of those topics in a bit more detail, I'd love to just ask Perry to talk a bit about the research that she did and how that helped her to be ready for the interview process.
Yeah, definitely. Seconding what Rachel has just said, in those specific examples, if you haven't done your research, then it's going to be quite hard to formulate those answers. So some of the things that I used to do was I'd always look at the company website. A key thing in any asset management interview, whether it's distribution, operations, investments, is knowing the size of the firm, the AUM of the firm, what they invest in, the kind of fundamentals of what that company does. Some houses are fixed income, some are equity, some do everything. So I think that was really key. I also used to look up recent news, any articles that I found really interesting about the company or company specific people. D&I was something I used to look at, and if I saw maybe their head of ESG had written a fantastic article, I would try and bring those specific things up in the interviews to show that not only had I done my research as a tick box, but I was actually genuinely interested in the company and interested in working there, and then also showcasing that company's values and their people aligned with my values. So I think they would be my top tips on researching companies beforehand. I'm not sure if Stan can add anything to
that. Thanks, Perry. I would say your goal in this is to try and anticipate as many questions beforehand, because the last thing you want is to be flummoxed by quite a difficult question and you're umming and ahhing and asking for 30 seconds, which is absolutely fine to do, but you want to try and put yourself in that position as less often as you can. And it's pretty simple how you do that. You basically just look up every single soft skill question you could get asked, and you look up every technical skill question you could be asked for your chosen role. If it's investment banking, depending on the level you're at, you might be asked on different ways you value a company. If you're in asset management, you might be asked for a beginner's edition in terms of how you analyze a stock. And you just go away, you write them all down, and you just come up with a couple of bullet points for each and how you can answer the questions. And then I personally would recommend spending the time to simply practice them and either record yourself or get somebody, either a family member or a friend, to look at or just watch how you do and just give you a bit of feedback. Even just watching yourself back. I mean, I remember doing video interviews for an internship a couple of years ago now, and I remember thinking, God, I'm charismatic. And then I'd look back at the videos and my mouth wouldn't move in the whole thing. I'd show no emotion and I would look like a robot. And so honestly, the amount of benefit you get from practicing and trying to be as aware beforehand of these questions does absolute wonders. I really promise you. I have so many really intelligent friends at university who didn't get a single grad role because they didn't prepare very well. And I know lots of friends who will happily admit that they're nowhere near as intelligent, but got lots of great offers because they prepared. I mean, it sounds a bit of a cliche, but the saying about failing to prepare is a really true one, I think, in the process.
That's really important. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think some of the points that Perry made about ways to prepare are really interesting, because it's, oh, sorry, somebody's just printing something out of my office, which is maybe causing some background noise. But it's not just about looking at the website, although that's incredibly important. But, it may be that some of the people in the firm have done a podcast, or, it's going to be really impressive if you actually listen to their podcasts and say what you found interesting, or maybe ideas that you thought you agree with, or things that you weren't so sure about, you'd like to ask them about, that kind of thing, I think can really make you stand out from the crowd. So, by the way, I also wanted to say we now have quite a few of you attending, which is great. Do feel free to post questions in the Q&A, because at some point I'll just open up the floor to you, and I'll be putting your questions to our panelists. So feel free to address your questions to an individual panelist, or feel free to just ask general questions that we can throw out to everybody. So just to let you know, start populating that anytime, and then at some point we'll just sort of switch over to using that as the main source. But maybe I can go back to asking Perry and Stan, maybe thinking about some of the individual categories of skills, that Rachel had mentioned right at the beginning, but maybe you could talk us through in a bit more detail how you prepared for those, or specific answers that you felt were very successful, picking any of them that just jumped out at you from that list, or indeed other types of questions that you may have been asked.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with what Rachel was saying about not having the experience. Unfortunately, in my degree, it was right in the midst of COVID, so my internship got cancelled. I was very, very worried that I wasn't going to have really relevant experience to answer those personal questions. But like what Rachel was saying, I worked a part-time job, I did some volunteering, I had lots of interests outside of investments and the investment management world that I tried to draw on. I had relationships at work that are quite similar to the relationships I have now, just working in retail as a Saturday and Sunday job whilst I was at uni. And then also volunteering, you manage a lot of stakeholders in volunteering and organising events and things like that. And that is a lot of what I do in my day-to-day now. So don't ever think that any experience you have isn't valid. Try and draw on your real life experiences, because that will also come across as really authentic. But yeah, I really agree with what Rachel was saying, that it's not necessarily investment experience, it's just those day-to-day your part-time job, your relationship with your societies, if you're in the finance societies, have you done any networking and organising in that? It's all these key skills that are transferable. So that's what I would add on that.
So I think that's so important, because clearly everyone has to get their first internship sometime, or their first job in the industry sometime, and then by definition you wouldn't have had any experience before. So it's not necessary to have experience in the industry itself. And I remember actually one of the best graduate interviews I ever did as a recruiter was when somebody spoke about their experience working in the call center, and they spoke in a high level of detail about how they had sort of analyzed the process by which calls were answered and made some suggestions for how to improve the customer service, which was just so interesting. The way they spoke about it was super interesting, and it really made them stand out to me as a candidate. So maybe Stan, you could talk us through how you've kind of specifically approached one or two. You mentioned technical skills, soft skills. Maybe we can look at those two, and you could tell us a bit more detail about how you approach them.
Yeah, sure. Interestingly, ironically, I was just about to mention probably one of the best interview questions or answers I gave was about my experience at a call center as well, funnily enough. And basically the question was something on the lines of, tell me about a time you were asked to do something immoral and how did you react to that? And the reason why I'm sort of going back to like preparing stories, as Perry and Rachel and Tilly have mentioned, is so I had a story prepared about, I think, tenacity, or there was some sort of other soft skill that I had penciled down, my story about call center. But sort of realizing the situation, you can naturally adapt these things when slightly off the cuff questions come up. So I was able to adapt my story about being asked to give out flight vouchers rather than genuine compensation to really poor families as being something that I thought was immoral. And then when I went against that, and I sort of spoke about how I didn't follow company policy at times when I felt like it was unfair and I honestly thought I could get away with it, I was then met with the next question, which was, so do you have a problem respecting authority? Which I think then sort of goes into the second point, which is often in life generally, but definitely in interview questions, it's helpful to think about why the interviewer is asking the question. And often you'll get questions which are designed to test your own resilience in that interview. And often you'll get questions that are designed to assess whether you naturally are self-aware of the respective virtues and vices of everyday life and how you go about your business. I think just trying to like stay aware of those key principles and trying to incorporate them in your answers, rather than getting sent down this rabbit hole about what actually did happen on October 2020, or you've got to try and think about what's important. And then going back to like how you actually prepare for these questions, so definitely have a bunch of stories prepared that you can adapt depending on the question. And then beyond that, I think breadth is important. If you trot out the same story 3 or 4 times, it can come across as a little bit plastic. And I think I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks.
I think that's really important because, there aren't really trick questions. I mean, the interviewer is probably genuinely interested. Maybe they're looking for people who challenge authority, or maybe they're not. But the key point is you need to be able to function within the organization. So it's worth being authentic to yourself, because otherwise you might very well end up in an organization that isn't going to suit you. I think that Rachel made a really good point about that earlier around, it's okay to have weaknesses, and when you're asked to talk about them, you really need to be honest and not sort of default to the stock answer. But going back to Rachel, I mean, we want to keep this panel focus on the positive, but it would be really interesting just to hear about maybe some of the don'ts as well, about things that you've seen go wrong, or things that our attendees should be looking to avoid doing, either in their preparation or in the interview itself. And by the way, do feel free to start populating the Q&A with questions now, because we're happy to throw open the floor whenever people are ready. But in the meantime, it'd be great to hear about some of your sort of advice about what not to do.
I think the first thing I'd say, and it plays into what Stan just said a minute ago, is, sometimes interviewers, we don't do this, but I know some firms are very keen to kind of try and understand how you respond under pressure in an interview situation by asking you sort of quite contradictory, potentially, questions. So, there's very much the ability to stay calm under pressure. I think the other sort of thing not to do is, not to worry about having the perfect answer. I think quite often I'm interested in your thought process. Now, again, Rafa doesn't do this, but I do know some organisations that would say, how many fish are there in the River Thames? Now, I don't know how many fish there are in the River Thames, but I'm also not particularly interested in your answer. I'm really interested in your thought process for getting there. And it might be about testing how rational you are, how logical your thinking is, and, just how you deal with those style of questions. So I think remaining calm under pressure, putting forward a logical, sensible answer is key. I think even, again, sort of Stan touched on this, but even if you don't feel like you have lots of wildly different experiences, you will have worked in project teams in school, in college, in university. I'm sure you will have done either some volunteering or some part-time work. I'm sure that you will have, what did you do during the pandemic? How did you deal with that situation? So just thinking about the breadth of experiences you have, and, drawing on different parts of your life. And it could be to do with your family. You might be in a caring situation. You might have an emergency that you've had to deal with. So I think that there's lots of different things you can draw on. So to come back to Stan's point, not repeating the same stories. And then the final thing I would say is that sometimes I interview people who slightly name drop. So they know somebody in the organisation, or they've read about something that, they have a familiarity somewhere. And I think sometimes for me, that can be a real challenge, because I think they're probably just keen and enthusiastic and wanting to say, oh, well, I know that person. But it's just getting that balance between not appearing too nepotistic, and also just making sure that but you still have done your research. So you might have read about something or a particular idea that you've enjoyed. So I think just creating that balance. So sometimes there's some red flags about who you know and how you know them. And that can be a bit of cause for concern.
That's really helpful, thanks. And we are starting to get some questions in now through the Q&A, so thank you for that. And I'm actually going to direct the first one back to Rachel, which is an interesting one. Somebody's asking whether you would approach an interview with a recruitment firm differently than directly with the investment firm. I'm not sure whether you, Rafa, work with the recruitment firms, and whether you would expect candidates to approach this differently, or whether actually it's just exactly the same process, really.
I would approach them in the same way that you would approach the employer. So we do put some of our roles through recruitment agencies. We're a small organisation and we don't have a big graduate recruitment team. So sometimes we do. And I think you need to treat them with the same, in the same way that you would an interview directly with an employer. Many of the agencies these days are extraordinarily knowledgeable about the individual companies, their culture, what they might be after, how the industry is set up and how it works. And actually, getting on board with a really positive, a good agency could net you rewards in the future. So you might go to an interview with one organisation and not be successful. But if the agency remember you, they like you, you scored positively with whatever assessments or interviews they did, then they will come back round to you. So it can be a real door opener, where if you're in with an agency, it could lead to multiple opportunities. So I'd say prepare in exactly the same way and be prepared for the same style of questions.
That makes a lot of sense. Somebody's asked how to deal with this perennial question, tell me about yourself. And obviously you want to say something interesting, but you don't want to sort of go on and on so much that you sort of use up time that could be spent on more specific topics. I'd be really interested to ask Stan and Perry, when you felt you answered that question successfully, how long did you speak for? What type of things did you focus on? And why was it that you kind of felt that was the best representation of yourself, as it were?
Yeah, so I always kind of had the idea of my CV in mind, but obviously I wouldn't really talk about high school, but I usually started with what I was doing at university, why I enjoyed it, and then would usually go on to sort of hobbies and interests. I always, even in my recent interview a month ago when I was interviewing with different firms for my second job in the industry, I always used to follow up with a few things that I was interested in, like cooking. I think in my Janice Henderson interview, I actually said I really enjoyed cooking roast dinners, and I felt really embarrassed about saying that after, but they actually really liked that answer because they thought it was authentic. And the interviewer also likes cooking roast dinners, so that helped. But yeah, so it's nothing too silly. I think just keep your CV in mind, things that are relevant. Obviously don't talk about what random things you get up to on the weekend with your friends, but yeah, what you're studying at uni, what you're interested in, if you're working a part-time job. And then I always used to finish with hobbies and interests, because that usually coached more questions from them on why I was interested in those things, which is a bit more of a natural flow of questioning.
Yeah, that makes sense. How about you, Stan?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you're probably going to get asked it. So having a good answer to this one is important. Whether mine is a good answer or not, I leave it to Rachel and Tilly to assess. But what I did was I looked up how to answer this question. And something interesting that I saw and that I copied was trying to tell a story about yourself within 1 or 2 minutes that sort of takes you from a relevant point in life, not sort of 5 years old, but maybe in my case, it was when my first interest in finance started, which was around GCSE time. And for me, it was sort of telling a story of growing up in Devon, having particular ideals about what I wanted to do with my life, then going to university, how those developed, going to sort of various clubs, doing my best to try and get work experience wherever I could, getting told no by most places. And then that just sort of story of development about like why you're here. And then sort of coupled on with, okay, well, then I got an interest in finance. This is then how I pursued that. This is the different doors that I looked at. These are the skills that I picked up along the way. And now I'm here, I'm looking to take this step because of X, Y, and Z. And that's sort of me as a person and sort of explains my journey of development. I don't know whether that can potentially come across as a little bit rehearsed, but that was the approach that I took.
No, I think phrasing it as a story makes a lot of sense, because it engages the interviewer, because you just want that person to be drawn into you as a person, and you want the effect for them to want to ask you more questions. So I think I certainly agree just a few minutes is enough, because I've certainly been in situations where people have just launched into their entire life story and gone on for sort of half the interview time, which then makes it very difficult, because you then actually can't cover the rest of the ground that you need to cover. So I think definitely being really prepared, coming up with something kind of narrative, but also I think the advice to throw in at the end, some of your personal interests is a good one as well, because it makes you seem more human. I'd be interested in Rachel's take on all of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and this is about Perry's earlier point about fitting in with the culture and the values of an organisation, and making sure that you end up in the right place for you, where you're going to thrive and be successful. And I think that showing a bit of your personality, and, to Perry's point, you don't want to be inappropriate and talk about how drunk you got with your friends at the weekend, but at the same time, I think showing that you have some interests and that there are things that you do outside of work, I think it just makes you a more rounded human being. We're not hiring robots who just tick off tasks and do that. We're hiring people who we want to develop relationships with, who we want to progress through our organizations, and who we want to see succeed. And those people are human and hopefully have a lot going on in their lives.
No, absolutely. And there's a couple of questions that I think I'll just cover off really briefly. One was just somebody asking, do the answers have to be only related to work experience? I say definitely not. I mean, as I mentioned, I think various people have mentioned sort of different categories of experience that could be appropriate. I remember a candidate once using an example of their university roommate who had been through a difficult time, and how they'd supported that person and all the different things that they'd done to help that person recover from some difficulties that they were having, which was, that was an example of relationship skills or helping others. And then very, very often people talk about academic projects that they've done. I think particularly if you're getting a question from intellectual curiosity, like what better to talk about than, an extended essay or dissertation or a project that you've worked on at school or university. So I think you need to think about these topics in a very broad sense. Another interesting one, actually I'm interested in everybody's take on this, is what is the purpose of multiple interview rounds with a similar format but different seniority of interviewer? From my perspective, one of them is just that the very senior interviewer has to sign off, but they don't have the capacity to meet that many candidates, so they'll only be interviewing the finalists. But Rachel, any other perspective on that, or Stan or Perry want to chime in on that one?
I think for me, there's a piece about consistency. So, you know, it's really interesting when you read sort of feedback from multiple rounds, have people presented themselves in similar ways to all interviewers, or have they tried to be one thing to one interviewer and one thing to somebody else? You know, I work in HR, and I think sometimes people try and just maybe consciously, maybe not consciously, they act differently towards people in the business compared to people in HR. So I'm looking for consistency across the interviews, because then I feel reassured that that's how that person is going to behave when they get here. I think I agree with you, Tilly. You know, we don't have the capacity from a company perspective for everybody to interview all of the candidates. So we try to kind of sift out as we go through. And I think as well, you know, you might be on a rotational scheme or a rotational program, and therefore I might try and get you to meet, you know, you might do an HR interview and you might meet people who would be your manager or your mentor from one rotation and another rotation, so that they can all feed back and say, yes, this person's going to be a really great add to my team. I can really see how we would benefit from having them in the team.
That makes so much sense. And by the way, as soon as you walk in the door of that building, you're being interviewed. We always ask our receptionists for their feedback on candidates, and you'd be amazed. Sometimes people are really rude to the person who greets them when they come into the building, which is obviously silly, really, in my view, and unnecessary, because why not just be nice to everybody who you meet? So I did Stan or Perry, did you have any other perspectives on that question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that even in my recent interviews where I've now transitioned out of a graduate role into a whole nother company, that team fit is really, really important. And I think as much as you are being interviewed, and what Tilly's saying and Rachel is saying, very, very important, but also treat this as your interview process. Don't look at the stages as, oh God, I've got so many to do. Like, why do they want to ask me so many questions? At the end of the day, this is your career. You're going to be spending a lot of time with these people. So you also need to treat this as an interview for yourself. So meeting all those different people, try and gauge what is your feedback as well. Do you think you'll fit in? Do you like the culture? Do you like the values? Can you see yourself enjoying the work? So yeah, don't always look at that long process as a really negative thing, especially if you get the job. It's actually a really good way to build relationships before you start the job. So yeah, I actually think having a lengthier interview process is a really positive thing.
Just as a follow-up to that, actually, one really important thing that we haven't spoken about so far is what questions you asked, because it's always very impressive when candidates have good questions, and conversely actually unimpressive if people haven't really thought about what questions they want to ask, because it shows potential lack of interest in the role. So maybe we can just go around the panel and just hear some of the questions that were really important to you, Perry and Stan, and then maybe for Rachel, some of the questions that you think it's particularly interesting to hear from candidates when they come in.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been very, very passionate about diversity and inclusion. I was a GAIN undergrad and now I'm a volunteer. So that was something I always asked about, especially if I knew what D&I policies they had. I would try and bring those up and say, you know, what are you doing around D&I? I saw you did this in the news. How do you feel about that? What else are you doing locally in the team? I always used to ask as well, if I could find out how long the person had been there before the interview, that was quite helpful. And I usually ask them, like, honestly, why have you been here for so long? What makes you not go to a competitor? And I think that's when people are really, really honest as well. And you can tell a lot about a culture by why people stay there for such a long time. But they were the main two that I always asked, which I think actually gave me a really good overview of the culture.
Yeah, really interesting. How about you, Stan?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I think maybe it changes slightly depending on whether you know your interviewer in advance. So if you know who the interviewer is, I think that is obviously an opportunity for you to ask a bespoke question. You might have looked up their LinkedIn and see that they've worked at 3 or 4 different firms, and piggybacking off what Perry was getting at, asking them what their experience was like at other firms compared to the firm you're interviewing for is often like quite interesting for your own personal understanding about how different cultures compare. Because I confess something that I found quite amusing when applying for grad roles or internships was that a lot of companies come up with similar values on their websites about what they supposedly hold, and actually having someone who's been there and experienced different things is a really good opportunity to understand how much of that is true and what differences truly exist.
Yeah, and I think those are some really good questions that you guys are focusing on. I think to Tilly's point, it is a bit of a red flag for me if people don't have any questions to ask. And I think that you can be quite broad and you can ask questions that, I really appreciate questions about, how's the, what are the company priorities at the moment? What do you see happening in the next 12 to 18 months that's going to impact the company from a wider sort of economic perspective? So maybe those things have come up already in the interview, but I think just really making sure that you demonstrate that interest in this organization. What are its priorities? What does it see in terms of its growth? What areas might be challenging for the organization going forward? And then how does the bigger economic picture impact that organization? And just asking some questions, getting some views. And you might not have ideas yourself or have any views on that, and that's absolutely fine, but asking the questions and just demonstrating you're interested in that, I think is really positive. I think Stan and Perry have talked about the culture, the values. I think what asking about what tone the chief executive sets and how they work across the business. I think there's some good questions in that as well. So just understanding the individuality of the organisation that you've applied to.
I think also, I mean, don't be shy of asking the interviewer something quite personal to them. Like, I always appreciate it when someone says, "Oh, what's a typical day look like for you?" Because I think that shows that they're interested. It also shows that they're interested in the role because they want to know kind of what they might be doing in a similar position. Somebody once said to me, how does it feel emotionally when markets fall 20%? It was a really interesting question. Nobody had asked me that before. So it's just something that just interests you about that person is also likely to sort of appeal to them. Now, earlier on in the panel, Stan, you mentioned that there's a whole bucket of questions that fall under the technical, and somebody in the chat has asked, are there any good resources for practicing technical skill questions for someone who hasn't studied finance? How did you prepare for them? Perhaps you did study finance, I don't know, but in any event, I'm sure you prepared for them. So what were some of the resources that you used?
Yeah, so I did PPE, so I did some economics, and I was involved with a couple of societies, which are sort of introductory societies into investment banking and asset management. So I had some sort of basis, but mostly I got my prep from the internet, where I simply just typed in technical questions for X job. So I think it's Wall Street Prep, maybe Corporate Finance Institute. If you type in, I'm doing an investment analyst, asset management, graduate level interview, what technical questions can I ask? I mean, don't type that in, but technical question in a shortened format. You will find a lot of good questions out there that will help you to prepare. One thing that you can do, which is incredibly helpful if you have the drive to do it and you're prepared to get a few no's, is say you had a final round interview at Man Group and you were able to find me on LinkedIn and message me and saying, look, I've got a final round interview. Would you mind if I just ask you a couple of questions based on the sort of technical questions that you were asked? I mean, it's a massive leg up if you then do get those questions asked. I mean, I've been on the phone with a few people lately who have got interviews for Man coming up, and I'm sure if they get similar questions asked, it probably will be of some help. So I would potentially even go to try and find people from the company on LinkedIn and just ask them politely and say, look, do you mind if I just have 5-10 minutes of your time? And that can be a really helpful.
Sorry, Stan. I think there are also some really good, places you can go. So Glassdoor can be your friend in terms of people writing about their interview experiences and what questions they were asked. I think for me, our graduate and early careers roles, we don't say, you have to have a background in finance or economics or investments. But, I guess I'd be looking for people who just demonstrate an interest in it. So, have you read the papers in the last couple of weeks? Maybe you can get hold of a couple of copies of The Economist over the last couple of months and just find a couple of articles that interest you. So if someone asks you a question about inflation, then you're not the inflation expert who's going to talk in absolute detail about that, but you could just talk a little bit about energy prices or food prices or, something around that topic and how it's impacting people. people. And I'm not looking for a technical specific answer. I'm just looking that you've demonstrated an interest in the world around you, and you've sort of taken on board some of the big picture and the important topics that are hitting the news right now.
I know also a bit of a plug for GAIN, but GAIN does run some workshops on particular technical skills like how to analyze a stock. There is almost certainly some, there's a whole program of events coming up that you can find on the GAIN website, which I'm presumably you know where that is because you're on this call. But then if you go on YouTube and search for GAIN or Girls Are Investors, there's all the panels that have ever been recorded from past years are also up there, so you can look for topics that might be of interest to you on there as well. But I do know Wall Street Prep is very popular, and actually for the GAIN internship program, we offer that as a free, all the interns are asked to do a week of Wall Street Prep so that they hit the ground running in the internship. But I'm sure there must be some free resources on there. There's also Training the Street, which is, I think, a similar resource where there may be some free resources on there as well. There's also reading lists on the GAIN website with suggested books and articles that you can have a look at. Somebody's asked whether there's any difference between sort of going for internships versus full-time roles. Perry, you mentioned that you had a lot of internship interviews. Would you say they were any different, or really does everything that we've talked about sort of apply equally for internships?
I think they're pretty similar, to be honest. I think grad roles and internships were quite a similar experience for me. I think grad roles, you maybe have 1 or 2 more interviews, and it's probably a little bit more extensive because it's a longer program and you're probably likely to stay on. So it's kind of a bigger commitment and a bigger opportunity. But I would approach both the same, do as much research as you can, like we've said, and take all of these points on board.
I would agree with Perry, and I think from an employer's perspective, living the dream is having a relatively robust intern interview. You have your interns in for however many weeks over the summer, or however you set that up. And then ideally, without too many processes and more interviews in place, those people then become your future grads. So I would almost, from an employer's perspective, I would almost invest as much, if not more, in my intern interviews, because that internship then could hopefully become your graduate role, and that's just a brilliant opportunity for an employer to try you out, and to Perry's point, for you to try that employer out. So view those internships as sort of prolonged opportunities to find out about the organization, and absolutely do the same level of prep for an intern interview, because I would probably be as robust in that as I would with my grads.
No, I agree with that entirely. Somebody's asked about what is the best answer for why you're interested in working with our company, but I'm not sure we can answer that really, because I think unfortunately, better or worse, it's up to you to decide why the company's of interest to you. But does anyone want to throw out any thoughts on that one?
I think the flip side is, the people who answer those questions badly provide generic answers about why they want to work in the industry, and why they want to work in asset management or investments or whatever it might be. And I think that the better answers are people who can look at your company, to Perry's earlier point, some people do fixed income, some people do equity, some people do macro, micro, whatever it might be, just demonstrating that you have done a little bit of homework, and you've maybe read about the culture and the values, and you can align your skills and interests to that specific organization. I think that pays dividends. Perry, I'm sure you can add to that.
Yes, definitely. I think that on the point of degrees, I didn't do an economics degree, I did a history degree, so I didn't have that relevant financial experience. But like what Rachel's saying, if you do biomed at university, or you do chemistry, or you do biology, and you're really interested in sustainability and the way that nature affects the world and how finance can help that, COP26, all of these things that are coming out, and you're applying to an ESG firm, then ideally your views are pretty aligned already. So upon doing your research, try and find out what it is that firm does and what in your life that you're doing, you're studying, you're looking at, you're volunteering for, aligns with it. If you go to if you are really interested in sustainability and you go and apply for an asset manager, I don't know if they exist, but just that invests in oil and doesn't care about the environment, then it will probably come across really, really quickly in the interview. So I think, like what Rachel was saying, try and streamline that research and find what actually aligns with you before you even interview or apply, to know if it is the right fit.
I think I agree. I mean, the more research you can do, you're more likely to find something that's super interesting to you. Whereas if you do just scratch the surface and look at the website, then as many people have said on the panel already, some of them do sound very generic, so it's going to be much harder for you. So the deeper you go in a way in the research, it becomes self-perpetuating, because you'll be able to answer any number of questions at a much deeper level. Somebody said, how many questions should we ask? Well, 2 or 3 seems about right to me. 3, okay. You can't, I mean, you want to ask good questions, but you don't want to be completely dominating the interview with your questions. So it has to be a bit of a give and take. Normally you'll be asked for your questions at the end, and people will normally leave 5 minutes or something like that. So you can come up with 2 or 3, have a list in case they answer them super quickly and you don't want to run out of questions if there's more time. Somebody's asking, I'm looking for the first full-time role. Do you suggest going to a non-asset management role for now and changing later? Waiting a bit longer till I get a role in asset management. It sounds like Perry and Stan, you've both landed graduate or recent graduate roles in investment management, which is great. But what other options did you consider? And maybe we can hear from you two first, and then maybe Rachel, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what other types of roles might you look at for sort of second stage recruits to the firm.
Yeah, I'm sure Stan probably had a look around as well, but I actually secured around 4 graduate schemes and only one of them was asset management. I was very, very keen to be in asset management. So all of those routes were kind of in IT companies or tax or things like that. So I could get some financial exposure and then navigate across. I think basically whatever happens for you is probably the right thing. If you get into a non-asset management role and then you move into the industry later in life, I have some very, very successful people here who have come from an energy background, who have come from an accounting background, and they've transitioned over fine, and they're really valuable to the company, because we've all worked in asset management since we started. So they bring a really different, diverse outlook on things. But also I've gone straight into asset management and also had a really great time. So I think definitely keep your options open. Maybe if you go for an accountancy interview, don't tell them that in the future you hope to move over to asset management. But the key thing, I think what we were saying earlier, is transferable skills. Whatever industry you work in, the world, especially financial markets, are so interconnected that hopefully that job will give you some industry knowledge that will be valuable to an asset manager in the future. So if it's not the asset manager you want straight away or the job that you want straight away, you've got a long time to work. So I think just trust the process, trust the journey, and keep in mind what you want to end up doing.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. And it's easier said than done, but don't stress if you don't end up in your perfect role. I remember mentoring this one person who said that if they didn't get Goldman or JP, then they didn't want to work. And I mean, you quickly realize when you start applying to quite a few firms how you need to be much more open-minded than you probably are at the start. And that was definitely true for me. I think in part for that is that there are so many roles that you don't even know exist right now that could either be perfect for you or that will open up in the future, and that it'll be a great opportunity down the line. So don't get overly stressed about trying to plan every year of your career now. And then based on like how you can think about a sort of the optimal decision for your career, you really want to think about like what you would be most interested in, and also like where do your skills lie, which tend to be pretty well correlated. But spending a lot of time thinking about those questions and trying to evaluate how each of the career options will help you along that path is helpful. And if you're very much in 2 or 3 minds about what you want to do initially, if you're able to find a grad scheme that has rotations, that's also a potential help to you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what everyone's saying. I think careers are incredibly fluid these days. People move industries, people move roles. I think if your passion is asset management, then what roles are you going for? Are there other roles you could go for that's perhaps not your dream job right now, but it would still get you into the sector? So if you're very much focusing on asset management, all asset managers have a range of roles. Yes, there are the kind of grad schemes and those sort of front office roles that you might be thinking about right now, but there's a huge range of other ways that you could get into asset management, be that through a support role. Perhaps you would work in compliance or IT or finance or whatever your skill set is. There are lots of ways in, and companies are very much more focused now on mobility within the organization once you've got there. So once you've got a foot in the door and you've come in a different route that's perhaps not a grad scheme, then there are always ways of moving around, demonstrating your interest, making sure you network with the right people once you've arrived. And we're really, really open-minded. I also think if you go away for a few years and do something different, and then you come into asset management later, I mean, amazing. I'd never even heard of asset management until I was in my 30s. Why would I have? So I think there's lots of routes in, and I think don't sort of be disheartened if this first sort of round that you're doing doesn't lead to a role. I think just keep hammering away. And the final point I'd make is something that sort of Stan said, is that what are your strengths? What do you really enjoy? And how can you make sure that feeds into the roles you're applying for? Because that comes across so clearly when you're on the other side of the interview desk about what people really care about, what they're good at, what their strengths are, what their passions are. And actually, if being in that front office fixed income role isn't your drive, your passion, that will come across at interview. So sort of know yourself, be self-aware, and go for something that really suits you as an individual.
I couldn't agree more. And I didn't get into investment management until I was in my late 20s. I started out as a management consultant. I think management consulting is a great background for investing, because you learn about how companies work, what makes companies successful, what executives' concerns are, and so on. And then I actually worked in a couple of large companies. So I think company grad schemes are great if you want to get into investment management, because most investments are in some form of either the equity or the credit of a company. So if you can get inside a large company and figure out some of the things that makes that company successful, it'll make you even more interesting as a candidate later on, to be honest, and you'll have tons of things to talk about. You have to learn to be a really good observer of the company as well as of your own role. But I think the more you can actually learn to observe things from different perspectives, that can be super interesting to employers. So listen, we're coming towards the end of the time, and we've answered all the questions in the Q&A. Before we wrap up though, I just wanted to throw it back open to our wonderful panelists, just to ask whether you have any final advice for our attendees, or any final comments or anything that we haven't managed to cover so far along the way.
My final sort of closing comment is just to say, just be yourself through the interview process. Perry said it earlier, but you spend a long time at work, and you don't want to end up somewhere that you can't be your authentic self, that you can't bring your whole self to work. You want to be somewhere where you're going to be really happy. So don't get caught up in the bandwagon of got to apply for this scheme. My friend said this scheme's open. Do your homework, take a step back, and just sort of focus on what's going to work for you.
That's so important.
I think following on from what Rachel said about being yourself, and I think one way that you can really have conviction in your answers and self-belief is by doing that research. If you're sure of what you're saying and you're sure of who you are as a person, when they ask you those questions, hopefully your answer will be natural, organic, and authentic. But I think the main thing, and I think it's helped me in my most recent role as well, securing this, is asking the questions. We always get caught up on how many applications you've done. Like Rachel was saying, you get really stressed and I just want a job. But it is a really important life decision, and it's really, really crucial if you like where you work. So make sure you ask those questions, which shows even more interest, and treat it as an interview for yourself.
Yeah, I agree with all of those points. I've just got like a few little pieces of advice based on how you should think about preparing for interviews. One, on the market sizing question, I think Rachel mentioned it earlier, you might get questions such as how many windows are in San Francisco. And if you haven't prepared for a question like that, it is almost impossible to answer, I think, on the spot. But actually, if you go away and look up how to structure a market sizing question, it isn't the sort of horrible, daunting problem that it perhaps looks at first. And you basically just want to outline your assumptions and then approach it like a Fermi problem, which you can look up after this, and it's actually not that complicated. So we've said it 1,000 times, but definitely do your prep. And then the other things I would say is try not to be arrogant. And I don't mean that in the sense that I would expect you to be, but if you might have done a little bit of research and you're asked to pitch a stock, or you're asked to talk about a major theme in markets, whether it's recession, whether it's inflation or something else, almost certainly the person interviewing you will know so much more about that. And now in an investment role, I'm told that it's quite normal if I am useless for the next 2 years before I actually become valuable to my team. So they are not expecting you to have the answers in that interview. What they're expecting for you is to be interested in what's going on and to have a relatively sort of, you want to approach the problem and the question in the right way. Like, that's really what they're looking to assess. So you can say, from my research, this is what I think is important for answering this question at the moment. This is how I go about evaluating that. Here's my answer based on that. I'd be interested to know what you think, given your experience. It's a much better way of doing it, as opposed to saying Apple's great because of X, Y, and Z, or inflation is going to go X, Y, and Z because I've read this article. It just can, you should be a little bit more nuanced in the way you answer those questions, I think.
Those are all such important points, and I totally agree. The company's not looking for you to necessarily solve all their problems. They just want to understand how you think and how you approach the art of problem solving. And just in my 2 cents, I would like to add one small point, which is that I've interviewed so many women, since this is a panel for girls are investors. And very often when we're asked about our role in a team, we don't actually attribute successes to ourselves. We'll say, oh, I was on the team and we did this and we did that and we did the other thing. But the company isn't interviewing the team, they're interviewing you, and it's okay to claim attribution for what you did. So please always say, I was on a team and we were organizing an end of year event, and I was responsible for setting the budget, and I was responsible for doing the ticketing, or whatever it was. But whatever you did it, and please say that, because otherwise the firm isn't going to be able to know. They won't be able to actually pinpoint your answer and your contribution in the responses that you give. So that's just my 2 cents. But listen, we're nearly coming up to the end of the time. I think we've answered the questions that we had. And I just like to say it's an absolute pleasure hearing from all of you. You've given us so much to think about, and you're all so thoughtful, and it's incredibly generous of you to take the time to be with us today. So on behalf of all of our attendees, I'd just like to thank you and say what a pleasure it's been. And I hope it's been helpful. And I think with that, we'll bring this event to a close. All the best to everyone. Bye.